Evening all. Sounds like a police officer, that does, doesn't it? Hello, I'm back again. This is a second video. We're going to, this time around, we're going to broadcast a reading of chapter 2 of the book. The book is called Walking on Cinders. It's 10 years old this year. It's my second novel, and it came out in the early part of 2010. If you can hear elephants upstairs, that's my housemate coming down the stairs.
Have I missed it?
No.
Good.
We haven't started yet, Gareth, don't worry.
Wonky muffin, when I see that.
Yeah, probably, I don't know. I need to get onto my Twitter and check that it actually is broadcasting live for me, because I can't tell. Thank you. Anyway, I've just made some muffins, and I'm hoping that they're not going to be, like, horrible, because they are quite hot. They've just come out of the oven, literally just come out of the oven. Quite nice.
I was waiting for you to go, Hang on, I'm trying to find your Twitter. Have you linked it to me somewhere?
I sent it to you yesterday.
Let me just go to your page. It's on there, isn't it?
It is indeed. Sorry for the delay, folks, while we just,
Just hashing out some technical difficulties. Oh yeah, you're live.
Oh. There we go. Okay, you can stop it now. We'll get this right in a couple of videos' time. Anyway, this is Walking on Cinders, and this is chapter 2. Are we sitting comfortably, Gareth?
Yes.
Chapter 2. Arthur Bingham traced a tired finger around the edge of his coffee cup as he looked over the other chairs and tables and out towards the street beyond. Recently, his work had been getting him down. Since the revolution, everything seemed far more regimented. The president kept a close eye on those in his internal cabinet, and this meant that he had to work beyond his ability and ahead of schedule just to please him. Arthur was a government detective. That is to say, he kept tabs on people and made sure they did not vanish off the radar. A short, stocky man, he had thinning grey hair and was bald on top, and he covered this by wearing an old-style reporter's hat, the type that was famous in the early decades of the 20th century. He was getting old now, having spent much of his time working for the royal family in the days before United rule, and his age meant that he was now considered not the right material for the front line of United intelligence. Instead, he was tasked with the job that nobody else wanted, for little or no personal gain. This morning was no exception, although today, instead of trawling the streets of London at daybreak, he had found solace in one of the many cafes and sandwich bars that had sprung up in the capital during the pre-war years of prosperity. Or to him, it was a godsend that small businesses like this existed, which had only at one time sold sandwiches and baguettes to Londoners at lunchtime, had now diversified. Now, in order to deal with the national drop in the country's economy, economic prosperity and a distinct fall in customer numbers, many had taken to opening far earlier in the morning and serving breakfast, alongside coffee and other hot drinks, which complemented their normal lunchtime menus. It provided a place to gather his thoughts, and in many ways it brought him back to reality and gave him time to think. Arthur Bingham had been dispatched so early on a dismal and dreary morning to search out a pretty young lady who intelligence sources said was leading a suspicious double life. Lengthy investigation and secret surveillance had revealed that day by day she worked as a waitress in one such coffee shop, Strand Sandwiches. But by night she transformed into the adored and infamous Force's sweetheart called Miss Marmalade. The government had discovered the fact in recent weeks, and now they wished to acquire her services. President Barker had presented Arthur with his most important task to date. Many United governments, he said, were secretly planning a series of deployments and offences aimed at bringing the dark days of war to an end. To do this, certain secret documents needed to be transferred between countries, particularly the United Isles of Great Britain and United France. The problem was to make the transfer without risking discovery. The Force's sweetheart provided the perfect distraction, since by placing the documents on her person and then dispatching her to perform in Europe, the government effectively reduced the risk of sabotage while still making a quick and effective transfer. It was an ingenious solution, for even the reformed generals would not think twice about launching an attack against the famed Miss Marmalade. However, the Force's sweetheart had already declined the offer, and this placed the government and indeed the president in a very awkward situation. By the time her response came through, things were getting serious. Across the world, united forces were taking on the reformed enemy in strategic battles in which they lost more and more land. To the united leaders, it soon became clear that these things were coming to a head, and they had no time to waste if they wanted to act on their advantage. President Barker had dispatched Arthur Bingham to meet with Miss Marmalade's regular persona and sabotage her at her place of work, accost her as only a government detective might do. And this, he hoped, would be enough to convince her to change her mind. Personally, Arthur Bingham held out little hope that a short conversation between himself and the singer, especially in a place where no one knew her secret life, could ever succeed. But he did agree with the president that the isolation and location of such a meeting and a surprise visit would make the Force's sweetheart feel somewhat uncomfortable, and that was why he had been here almost an hour early, reading a newspaper and occasionally ordering another cup of coffee, which he hoped would keep him alert enough to continue his waiting game. For a while, it went on like this, with little to no break in the monotonous silence that accompanied the movement of his eyes across the endless lines of print. In fact, he was considering leaving the shop for a well-deserved cigar, but that was before the doorbell chimed and a strange customer entered. The man had almost completely concealed his identity, for he wore black from head to toe, and he had a dark balaclava on with only a hole for the mouth, through which a scruffy beard could just be seen. Over his shoulder he carried a large rucksack, and as he passed by the table and out towards the back of the shop, Arthur heard him whisper some indecipherable words under his breath. This new addition to the situation was strangely exhilarating, for anyone walking the streets in such garb was certainly one to watch. So Arthur decided he would sit quietly and wait, see how things progressed. Quickly, he folded the paper up and wrote a few lines on his clipboard to remind him of the man's appearance. Who knew such an information might be of use later? The minutes passed by and the man did not return, so Arthur, believing he might have passed out through some back door, decided there was time for that cigar after all. Even standing on the far side of the street, he had a clear view through the front of the window and into the shop, so he would notice if Miss Marmalade did happen to arrive at work. The taste of a cigar was strong in his mouth, and it was this addiction that pulled him through the major stresses of his job. From his position across the street, there was just enough distance to escape. Suddenly, smoke began billowing from behind the shop, as if something was on fire, and it signalled a dangerous warning in Arthur Bingham's mind. Hesitating for no more than a second, he turned to run as the whole street exploded in a ball of fire behind him. Realising he would not get far, the detective lunged forwards to seek cover behind a rubbish skip. His heart was thumping in his chest. The fireball was so sudden, a blaze of reds and yellows. Then, as quickly as it had blotted out all that was around, it died away, remaining only in a small corner of the Strand. The enemy might think twice about attacking Miss Marmalade, he thought, as he fell back against a brick wall, but that doesn't stop them waging war against her government. For Jennifer, the war had provided glamour and fame. Her double life had, so far, provided her with many new additions and benefits. She had numerous male admirers. Soldiers were all over her, and she loved it, even though frivolities and relationships were emotionally unstable. But all of this was about to change. During the course of the day to come, events would unfold that would change her life forever, and she would never be able to go back to her old life again. The back street in which Jennifer was now walking was dark and damp. The buildings on either side of the cobbled street nearly met in the middle, and they blocked out almost all sunlight. They were the kinds of buildings you might expect to find in the older academic cities of Oxford and Cambridge, but streets like this still existed in London too. They hid in the very heart of the city, between the buildings of glass and stone, and Jennifer headed this way every morning. The cafe where she worked was located on the corner of the Strand. This was a popular destination for the rich and famous, the heart of the city's entertainment district, and numerous theatres were raised along the Strand. But since the war had begun, a great many of them had been boarded up, for some were simply no longer viable. Jennifer soon noticed this, and for as long as she could remember, her dreams had been of owning one. Miss Marmalade could afford one, of course, but Jennifer wanted to make it on her own. Pausing momentarily in thought, she glanced to her left and finally happened upon the towering figure of Brown's department store. It seemed to be looking down upon her, frowning. But Jennifer knew, like most Londoners, that Brown's made the best English breakfast money could buy, and she had no qualms about venturing inside. Considering the hour of the journey to work, the streets were unusually crowded, and not with business people either. There were a few wearing dark suits and carrying briefcases, but for the most part, they were normal, everyday people. Women, children, and a spattering of men. It seemed strange for so many people to be here on the Strand. Jennifer noticed it as she pressed a button for the pedestrian crossing. The lights seemed to take no longer than usual to change, but when they did, a long line of bicycles and hovercars built up at the red light, snaking far past the end of the street and disappearing out of sight. Wondering what all the commotion was about, Jennifer hurried across the busy road and into the relative safety of a department store. Inside, the shop was symmetrical, and there were many different areas to choose from. Whether it was books, fashion, or gardening materials you were after, Brown's department store had it all. It was then that Jennifer realised how long it had been since she had visited a store like this, and so, walking gingerly forwards, she studied a map on the shop floor. The cafe was on the 3rd floor, and that meant navigating 3 towering escalators, a job made very tricky in her stiletto high heels. Well, the cafe was laid out not unlike a futuristic starship. Every surface was fashioned in aluminum and chrome. In the middle of the room, 2 elderly ladies with fishnet hats dished up bacon and beans, and Jennifer quickly took her place at the back of the queue. Feeling the distant lack of change jingle in her pocket as she left the pay desk, she helped herself to a plastic chip and wished that she could be. She helped herself to a plastic chip which could be inserted into one of the radio speakers at the table, and she proceeded to the last vacant window seat. In front sat an elderly man with a black and white border collie, and behind was a middle-aged couple. The man wore dark sunglasses, and the woman had strawberry blonde hair. Jennifer tucked into her breakfast. Oh, she was famished, and it wasn't until she was halfway through a runny fried egg that she paused mid-mouthful and inserted that small circular disc into the slot at the very centre of the table. Immediately the radio fired up, just loud enough for her to hear, although much to her annoyance she was not met by the latest chart music, but by the voice of a dull and repetitive news broadcaster. At first, Jennifer returned to her breakfast, paying little attention to the story being referred to on the radio behind her. She considered turning it off, but had second thoughts when the newsreader paused and began a new story. "A black day for London," were the stark words that greeted her through the speakers, followed by "Insurgents strike again." Jennifer tried hard to catch every word, for this was not the kind of headline you heard often in London these days. The radio very rarely referred to the war at all, choosing instead to play popular music aimed at taking people's minds off the dangerous and ongoing conflict, and these words clung coldly to the heart. As one that always longed to be in the know, Jennifer listened intently to the rest of the bulletin, for if anyone were to ask Miss Marmalade about the attack, a foreign soldier for instance, she would need to know fact from fiction. The newsreader continued. "Today is a bleak day for London. After a sustained period of peace in the capital, insurgents have attacked a building in the city. At the current time, the location of the incident has not been officially verified, but soldiers, believed to be from the Asian Republican Bomb Squad, did not appear to have a clear motive. All 4 were killed on impact, and it is known that they were on the list of Republican insurgents who live within a short distance of the city. Intelligence sources say..." Jennifer stopped, listened, and gazed into the space in front of the table. How could something like this happen in London? The real war always seemed so far away, yet now it was right on the doorstep. No, it couldn't have happened. And in frustration she yanked the plastic chip away from the table so the radio went dead. Soon she was nibbling on the corner of her toast and listening to those around her. The old man with the dog was humming quietly to himself, and the middle-aged couple were deep in conversation. Jennifer homed in and listened to any gossip they might be saying. "I bet they've been planning it for weeks," said the man with a mouthful of bacon. "Yes, I'm sure," the woman replied. "But what surprises me is why they chose this target. I mean, what would they want with such a nice little tea shop?" "Yes, I know," the man said, came the man's voice again. "It was such a nice little shop. Strand sandwiches. I used to go there often." Strand sandwiches. Jennifer repeated the name in her head until the meaning sank in, and by the time it did, she was already halfway down the escalator. The street outside seemed even busier than it had been half an hour earlier, and now Jennifer knew the reason why. Everyone wanted to capture a glimpse of the attack and the remnants of the building, the place where she worked. She had to think fast in order to take it all in. The corner of the Strand was just up from Trafalgar Square, and it was blocked off by a police cordon. Even from this distance, she could see smoke rising high into the sky and debris spilling all into the road. Jennifer momentarily wondered why she hadn't noticed the commotion earlier. There were more than a dozen firefighters no more than 20 feet away, and she knew immediately what she had to do. Pushing forwards through the crowd, she was stopped by a burly police officer. She waved her name badge frantically in his face, but he didn't take any notice. "I'm sorry, miss. Nobody's allowed to pass by order of the Metropolitan Police." "But this is my place of work, my job and my livelihood," Jennifer cried out in distress. "I know it's a shock, miss, but our primary concern here is to dampen down the fire and try to rescue anyone who might be trapped inside." "There might be people in there?" Jennifer screamed, suddenly thinking of those she knew. "Oh, we don't know for sure," the policeman added. So far we haven't been able to get near." Jennifer's face was a picture of horror. There were tears streaming down from her eyes and her hair was a mess. She was only partially comforted when Derek, the manager of the cafe, suddenly ran towards her, arms open. "Oh, Jennifer," he cooed. "It's terrible. I don't know what I'm going to do. You don't know how glad I am to know that you're safe." He looked down and brushed the hair from her eyes, and at that moment Jennifer couldn't bear to look up. He was such a good man, and she was just deceiving him. She pulled away, and she did not notice. She pulled away, and as she did, she noticed a British soldier at the very corner of her vision. He had shaggy brown hair and looked like it hadn't been combed in a while. His face was young. He looked innocent. Jennifer couldn't help but stare, even when she heard the policeman's voice in her ear, and she did not turn away at first. "If it's any comfort, miss, I have spoken to the President, and he says that our troops are already on the trail of these insurgents. There is a mention of a deployment of some kind tomorrow morning." "But what I don't understand is why they targeted my cafe in the first place," Derek questioned. The policeman paused for a moment and then reached up to wipe his brow. Shifting nervously, Jennifer couldn't bear it any longer. She turned her head back and looked at him straight in the eyes. "It's me," she wanted. She turned her head back and looked him straight in the eyes. "It's me they wanted to kill," she said. So that's chapter 2 of Walking on Cinders, and I will be back tomorrow night with chapter 3 again at 6 o'clock. Hopefully you can join me then.